Okay, we're recording this. I'll just make it, I'll wait until 12:30 on the dot and then we'll start, so another minute.
Okay. Thanks for being here today, Chloe. I know it's your day off, so thank you.
No, all good. We've got Paw Patrol on in the background, so Mike is happy.
Love it. Okay.
All right, we'll start this proceeding. So first of all, it's always traditional to acknowledge the acknowledgement of country, and today I'm calling from the Darug and Gurungai Peoples Nation, and like to acknowledge their elders past, present and future for their continued custodianship of the lands and waterways of which we are passing through today. And so welcome everybody to today's confirmation of candidature for Rebecca Lozina. I'd like to acknowledge her supervisory panel made up of Professor Rhonda Craven as Principal Supervisor, with co-supervisors Emeritus Professor Alex Yuan, Dr. Chloe Gordon, and Dr. Valeria Rigabon. And today's CoC expert panel is Professor Herb Marsh, Professor Jessie Gow, led by the most magnificent Associate Professor Baljinder Sadra as the chair. So without any further ado, Rebecca, I'll hand over to you. After that, we'll hand over to Baljinder for the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricky, and thank you all for your presence here today to listen to my confirmation of candidature presentation. Hopefully it moves. I'd like to do, sorry, it's just lagging from my end. Here we go. I'd like to acknowledge that, I'd also like to do an acknowledgement of country and acknowledge the First Peoples and traditional owners and custodians of this land, and pay my respects to elders past and present and thank them for their guidance as we walk in their footsteps. I'd also like to express my heartfelt gratitude to my supervisory team for their invaluable support over the past year. Their expertise, guidance, and constructive feedback have been instrumental in getting me here and where I am today, so thank you. My journey towards a PhD commenced after listening to Professor Rhonda Craven and Mr. Laurie Perry deliver a talk on Indigenous game changers and all the wonderful projects that had been created to help our Indigenous population flourish. Deadly Start, Deadly Futures, Deadly Teaching, Deadly Home Reading, Deadly Cultural Connections, to name a few. And after hearing about all this incredible work, I was inspired, and to be quite frank, I wanted in. And I wanted in because for me, these programs speak to my passion about helping support children who come from or experience disadvantage. And so I decided to join the Deadly Start Enabling Preschoolers Literacy, Numeracy and Wellbeing project. Now, Deadly Start was designed to improve literacy and numeracy skills as well as psychosocial wellbeing in our Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australian preschool populations. Professor Rhonda Craven and the chief investigators listed on this slide sought to provide preschool students with a deadly start or an awesome beginning to literacy and numeracy by working with local Wonnarua community to culturally adapt existing and efficacious literacy and numeracy programs for preschool students aged 4 to 5. And for literacy, Holmes reading and oral language intervention and Learning Links' Reading for Life intervention were culturally adapted for the Indigenous Australian population. And local community members were recruited to volunteer as Indigenous preschool champions who were trained to administer this intervention and deliver attributional and internally focused feedback in order to enhance preschoolers' self-concepts and then hopefully enhance their overall psychosocial wellbeing. This PhD project intends to contribute to this large-scale study by collecting and analysing data from multiple stakeholders, including preschoolers, carers, parents, and early childhood educators, centre directors, and those administering the intervention, to identify their perspective of the impact of the Deadly Start literacy intervention on preschoolers' literacy skills as well as their psychosocial wellbeing. Now, for those of us who've been residing in Australia for the past decade or so, no doubt you would have seen these headlines or similar in the media. Australia falling behind on Indigenous literacy, ABC News 2011. Indigenous kids falling behind in literacy, SBS News 2012. Indigenous literacy rates on the decline, 9 News, May 2014. No improvement in literacy, numeracy of Indigenous students, report shows, Courier Mail 2016. And by no means is this an exhaustive representation of the news headlines on Indigenous literacy skills. In fact, as the years progressed, it seems so too have the headlines, with no change in perspective toward the literacy standards in our country. Things like we've seen headlines like literacy an issue in Aboriginal welfare, 9 News, November 2019. Closing the gap, Australia's Indigenous inequality, not good enough, BBC News 2020. Class divide, as Indigenous children fail to catch up at school, the Courier Mail. Too many school students are falling behind. How do we how do we help those most at risk? The conversation. Australian students falling behind, is our education doing more harm than good? And NAPLAN results highlight need for action on reading. And the headlines get worse as I flick through them. The headlines actually get worse. Disturbing signs we're failing a whole generation of Aussie kids. 1/3 can't read. Australia's education system has resulted poor reading skills, and so. It's evident from these headlines that there is a societal concern about literacy standards in our population. But those were simply news headlines. Let's take a closer look at some of the national assessment results for our Indigenous population. So NAPLAN is a statewide measure designed to test literacy and numeracy skills in our students in years 3, 5, 7 and 9. And they measure reading, writing, conventions of language and numeracy. Now, in reading, Indigenous Australians across all age groups in 2024 were around 3 times more likely than their same-aged non-Indigenous peers to need additional support with reading because they were not achieving the expected learning outcomes at time of testing. So again, these results are concerning and, more needs to be done, clearly. All right. According to the Australian Education Research Organisation, the science of reading offers the strongest evidence for how children learn to read, and it combines research from different disciplines. It's from cognitive psychology, it's from neuroscience, it's from education, literacy, special education as well. And basically, what the evidence shows is there are particular things that are needed for reading to occur. And the foundation for reading is oral language development. And it's seen as a biologically primary skill set that most humans pick up naturally. And according to Geary and Sweller, children master it naturally through repetition and motivation, whereas reading is a biologically secondary skill that needs to be explicitly taught. Now, according to the simple view of reading model, reading occurs as a result of being able to recognize written word and also being able to understand what the word actually means. And so to be able to do this, there are a set of sub-skills that you need to teach children in order to effectively know how to read. And these sub-skills are known as the 5 or 6 keys to reading and include phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, comprehension, and oral language. Now, in addition to literacy, psychosocial wellbeing is another important area of focus in Deadly Star because positive self-concept impacts school success. Long-term engagement and aspiration to thrive is strongly determined by student motivation, and emotions influence academic achievement. So it makes sense to combine the two when you're assessing literacy and administering literacy interventions. All right. The theoretical perspectives guiding this investigation include Nakata's Indigenous Standpoint Theory, which is a theoretical approach used to provide Indigenous accounts and perspectives on Indigenous experiences, which according to Nakata weren't often well represented in dominant discourses. And so the present investigation aims to encourage Indigenous Australians to use their voice to share and reflect on their perspectives of the impact of the Deadly Start program.
Rebecca,
yes.
let me just interject for a while. Are you showing, do you have a PowerPoint slide for this? All I'm seeing is your cover page.
Oh, it's not moving with, oh, okay. I do have a PowerPoint slide. I've shared it with Ricky.
We're seeing context of PhD deadly start.
That's it. Oh,
That's it.
okay. No, I'm up
We
to
haven't
theoretical
seen it. So,
perspectives. Oh, goodness, that's not a good thing. What do we do, Ricky?
Ricky, can you just pop the presentation in the chat, please?
Yep, I can do that.
can you, oh yeah, you can't do that. Yeah.
So, Rebecca, you can continue. Ricky will drop it in the chat and people can access it.
Okay, thank you. I was incredibly sorry about that. I've lost my train of thought as well. Where are we up to? Marsh & Craven's review of the literature found that, and I quote, prior academic self-concept has a positive effect on subsequent academic achievement, which in turn brings higher levels of academic achievement, known as the reciprocal effects model. And so central, obviously, to this literacy intervention is the idea that self-concept, that we focus on self-concept as alongside literacy development. Ryan and Deci posit in their self-determination theory that motivation increases when autonomy is afforded and competence and connection or relatedness to others is experienced. The present investigation will be guided by this theory because understandably we want children to be intrinsically motivated to read. And I also want to, so I provided a rationale for the theoretical perspectives that have been guiding the intervention, but I also wanted to include a rationale for why I'm investigating multiple stakeholders' perspectives. Now, according to Bronfenbrenner's bioecological model of development, children don't develop in isolation. They shape and are shaped by the people in their environment. So from this model, we can deduce that supportive school and home environments are likely to foster greater developmental outcomes in children. And this is further supported by Lippard's research that children's academic achievement and social and emotional development are impacted by early classroom experiences, and also by Wilder's research on how parental involvement, including parental expectations of academic achievement, positively correlates with academic achievement. So given our understanding of the impact the environmental context has on children's learning and development, I think it's essential that the perspectives of those involved in the Deadly Start early literacy intervention program are considered.
Rebecca, let me just pause right here. Are you the one that's sharing your screen, or is it Ricky?
I'm sharing my screen, yeah.
Okay, could you just try unsharing it and then sharing again to see if maybe it will be less glitchy? I saw Taryn suggested in the chat, and I've definitely tried that before in Teams. Sometimes it just lags a bit, and then if you reshare, it'll kind of fix itself. Let's see.
Hooray!
Yay! Well
That
done.
worked. Great.
Try advancing one just to make sure
Yeah,
that
we can see
we
it
are
now.
able to follow.
There we go. Is it? No, it's not.
It's not advancing.
What if you click directly on the arrows at the bottom instead of like using your keyboard?
No.
That is so weird. Okay, then, and this is like through the present live function or just screen sharing?
Screen sharing.
Okay. All right, because there is like a present live function within like the Outlook online. Like if you have this saved to OneDrive or SharePoint, there is a way to do that, but I don't want to overcomplicate it. So yeah, whenever someone can pop in the slides in the chat, that would be great. Oh wait, there we go. Like I was able to follow that. All right,
Took a while.
we'll keep going. Thank you.
Okay. And again, I lost my train of thought. So which I think I was up to, yeah, okay, which leads me to which leads me to the present investigation. And the overarching purpose of this research was to identify research-derived strategies for improving Indigenous Australian preschool children's literacy development and psychosocial wellbeing. And so my PhD, hopefully, will consist of 3 studies. In study 1, I intend to conduct a systematic literature review of extant international literature to elucidate the characteristics of effective preschool literacy development programs for Indigenous children. Now, I'm conducting this research because there appears to be a scarcity of research focusing on literacy interventions in Indigenous preschool populations.
Yes, it doesn't work.
This,
Your panel.
goodness, this is this is going great today. This research question was posed to consolidate findings from international research to generate a more kind of comprehensive understanding of the research topic, to identify any gaps in this body of research, and to hopefully advance theory, research and practice. And I'm also hoping that the findings will better inform researchers, guide policymakers and creators and administrators of early literacy intervention programs for Indigenous preschool populations. For study 2, I intend to conduct semi-structured interviews with Indigenous and non-Indigenous preschoolers who engaged in the Deadly Start literacy intervention to identify their perspectives of the impact of the intervention on their literacy skill development and also on their psychosocial wellbeing. So this study is important because, according to Sun and colleagues, there has been a shift toward seeing children as active participants in society with voices that we need to listen to. And coupled with that is the significant number of preschoolers attending early childhood settings, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and increasing recognition of the importance of gathering feedback from users of specific programs kind of really reinforces the significance of preschooler perspectives being considered in this investigation. Now, study 3 will involve conducting semi-structured interviews with multiple stakeholders. So that includes parents, carers, early childhood centre directors, early childhood educators, and those administering the intervention to gain their perspective of the impact of the Deadly Start literacy intervention on preschool Indigenous and non-Indigenous children's literacy skills, as well as their psychosocial wellbeing. And this study is significant because it provides a holistic understanding of the program's impact by considering the perspectives of those directly and indirectly involved in the program. And as suggested earlier, my rationale for interviewing multiple stakeholders is based on the premise that children shape and are shaped by their environmental context. And so it's really important that we listen to the perspective of those who are involved in their lives. The aims of study 1 were to explore, therefore the aims of study 1 are to explore local and international research to identify and evaluate the characteristics of effective preschool literacy interventions in Indigenous preschool populations, to investigate the impact of preschool literacy interventions on literacy development in Indigenous populations, and the impact of literacy programs on Indigenous preschoolers' psychosocial wellbeing. So the research questions guiding this study include: what are the characteristics of effective preschool literacy interventions for Indigenous preschoolers internationally? What is the impact of preschool literacy interventions on literacy in Indigenous populations? And to what extent does participating in a preschool literacy program enhance Indigenous preschoolers' psychosocial wellbeing? Now, the systematic literature review will be written in accordance with PRISMA guidelines. Search terms have been formulated based on the Participants' Interventions Comparisons Outcomes Framework. A protocol will be developed and registered with Open Sciences Framework. For the search strategy, the inclusion and exclusion criteria will be established. A literature review search will be conducted using databases PsycInfo, Web of Science, Academic Search Complete, ERIC, and Scopus. And these databases were selected on the recommendation of ACU's research librarian. Following the search, a quality check will take place using the Cochrane's risk of bias method. Articles extracted from the databases, will be uploaded to Covidence and for screening, and duplicates obviously removed. And then we'll screen title and abstract before screening the full text. If there are any conflicts with examiners, then might bring in a third party to make a decision as to whether or not to include an article. Before analysis and evaluation of the direction of effect, size of effect, homogeneity of effects among studies, and strength of evidence will take place. Afterwards, data will be reviewed qualitatively and quantitatively. If the research outcomes cannot be combined, and sorry, I always struggle with his surname, Anesthesio suggests displaying all the results in a table or in descriptive form. Otherwise, a meta-analysis will be conducted to assess the effectiveness, which will be evaluated by calculating a weighted pool estimate and explained using a forest plot. Other considerations will include whether variables are dichotomous or continuous, whether to use a fixed effect or a random effect model, the heterogeneity test, and any publication bias before results are presented. It's a mouthful. Okay. The aims of study 2 were to identify Indigenous and non-Indigenous preschoolers' perceptions of the impact of the Deadly Start early literacy intervention on literacy and the extent to which these perspectives were the same or different for Indigenous and non-Indigenous participants. The impact of the Deadly Start early literacy intervention on psychosocial outcomes and the extent to which these perspectives were the same or different for Indigenous and non-Indigenous participants, and strengths, limitations, and suggestions for improvement of the Deadly Start early literacy intervention for Indigenous and non-Indigenous preschoolers. So the questions are, research questions are, what do Indigenous and non-Indigenous preschool children perceive as the impact of the Deadly Start early literacy intervention program on their literacy skills, including letter sound knowledge, knowledge of phonics and phonemes, reading comprehension, fluency, and oral language, and to what extent are any perceived impacts the same or different for Indigenous and non-Indigenous participants. Research question 2.21 is, what do Indigenous and non-Indigenous preschool children perceive as the impact of the Deadly Start early literacy intervention program on their psychosocial well-being? So in particular, looking at reading self-concepts, reading motivation, and reading emotions. And to what extent are any perceived impacts the same or different for Indigenous and non-Indigenous participants? And lastly, what do preschoolers perceive as the strengths, limitations, and suggestions for improving the Deadly Start early literacy intervention program? Now,
I'm trying to see if I can get it from my voice perspective, but I've uploaded the PowerPoint. Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you. Now, I won't go through the aims and research questions for study 3, only because they're identical to study 2. The only exception is with study 2, the focus is on interviewing preschoolers for their perspectives. In study 3, we're interviewing multiple stakeholders for their perspectives on the same questions, unless someone would like me to go through them.
I think it's okay for you to proceed. Yeah.
Thank you. The 3 main methodologies to be used in this PhD project are a systematic literature review, yarning methodology, and narrative analysis. So I'll focus on yarning methodology and narrative analysis because I already explored systematic literature review when I covered study 1. Now, in terms of yarning methodology, it'll be used in both studies 2 and 3. And according to Basarab and Naganda, and I'm sorry if I pronounce those names wrong, yarning forms part of Indigenous research methodologies where oral and or written conversation is used as a tool to gather important research data. Now, during the interview process, using yarning methodology would mean that you start with social yarning. You start by having a general chat with the interviewee and establishing rapport with them, get them feeling comfortable with you in the hopes that they will be more open and share their experiences with you. This then leads to research topic yarning, which involves you administering the intervention questions, asking them the questions tailored towards your study. Therapeutic yarning is shifting the role from the role of researcher to the role of listener and offering an empathetic ear, especially when they're talking about things that might be traumatic or emotional for them. So having that kind of understanding that some conversations might be difficult and challenging, and being empathetic. And collaborative yarning involves, 2 or more people getting together, sharing ideas, and hopefully creating new ideas from this conversation. And the narrative analysis will also be used so once the interviews have been conducted, they'll be transcribed, popped into NVivo, and narrative analysis to be analysed. And essentially we're coding and looking for themes from what the interviewees have been saying. In terms of ethics, ethics approval had already been granted for the Deadly Start Literacy Intervention project. So we just did a modification to the existing ethics application to have my name added as a researcher on the project, and it's been approved. And, you know, throughout the entire project, obviously I will be adhering to the ethics and research standards to make sure that, you know, we're doing right by our Indigenous Australian population. All right, so what have I accomplished thus far? And I'm sorry, that probably looks really small, and I did get advice to remove it, but I just ran out of time. Search terms for study 1 have been created and finalized based on, you know, the framework that I mentioned earlier, and this was achieved with the guidance of IPI's Dr. Diego Vasconcelos and ACU's research librarian. The inclusion-exclusion criteria have been set and databases have also been chosen. For study 2, existing interview questions were modified to account for preschoolers' age and developmental level. For example, materials from the intervention program were used as visual aids to support preschoolers' memory recall. They were also provided with options for how they wish to respond. So, for example, in one of the questions, they were given the option of drawing or using an iPad or referring to images in front of them to answer the question. Now, these strategies have been well supported by research into qualitative methods when interviewing young children. In terms of data collection, to Wanneroo country last July and did data collection for studies 2 and 3. I don't know if I've run out of time, but I'm happy to share what we did or leave it there. But that's basically what I'm up to. I've collected data for study 2 and 3. I've transcribed the study 3 material, and I'm halfway through transcribing study 2, and then I should begin analysis shortly. Silence. Okay. Lastly, proposed thesis chapter looks very similar to most other theses, and it begins with an introduction, theoretical perspectives, aims, methodology. Chapter 5, 6, and 7 will discuss my research results, and then followed by a general discussion and conclusion. And that's it. Thank you very much for your time.
Well done.
Yeah. Thank you, Ricky.
Sorry about technology. All right. I'd like to hand over to Baljinder to facilitate the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricky. Thank you, Rebecca. After Ricky shared the slides, I was able to follow along with you on my own. I was just looking at each of the slides as he was going along, but I also went back and looked at some of the previous ones that we had missed. So thank you for preparing that. You have added adequate, sufficient information in the slides, and some of the schematics are very pretty. Clearly, you worked very hard on them. And information there is fairly clear, but I have a couple of questions if I could clarify a couple of things before opening the floor to questions from other panel members. Right off the bat, could you clarify that? So the data is already collected and you are just transcribing things. So the largest study from which you are getting these data, was that a randomized control trial?
Yes. Yes, I believe so. Yeah.
So is that the case that the design of your study, where you're transcribing these interviews, still stays the same, or now it has changed? Because an RCT would have a comparison group and an intervention group, and so participants in the two groups would be importantly different because their experiences of the intervention or lack thereof are different. So is that still the case, or are you only focusing on one group or the other? I was not entirely clear.
Yeah, so it was purposive sampling, and we went out in July, mid of last year, and these interviews were held with the students who had engaged in the literacy intervention over 15 weeks prior.
So only the literacy group, not the
numeracy. That's right.
That's helpful. Thank you. I just wanted to double check that.
Yeah.
because if indeed you have interviews from the other group as well, things change a little bit and the methodology gets a little bit messy.
Yeah.
So it's only those who have experienced the intervention that you're trying to understand their experiences and the other stakeholders. That makes sense. That makes perfect sense. Yeah, okay, great. So that was kind of the main question that I had. And now that you've clarified that, one thing I want to suggest right off the bat is the reason that confusion arose was partly because in your rationale, in the document that you had submitted, and I think you even mentioned it as you were talking about it, that you said that the purpose of this research question was to elucidate the effectiveness of the literacy program. And once you frame it that way, at least for us, most of us at IPPE who are used to doing intervention studies, it immediately sort of brings that to mind. If it's something, if the goal is to test effectiveness of an intervention, then this design, the design that you are using for your PhD, doesn't quite do that.
Okay.
I hope I'm able to convey that.
Yeah.
Says that effectiveness requires that you are comparing the two conditions. You already have that as a separate study. It sounds like in a larger project, which is fine. It's none of it is a problem. I think it has to do with how you frame the sub goals of that larger project that are relevant for your PhD.
Okay. Thank
So-
you. I will take that into consideration. Yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, so that's kind of the main thing that I had. Other than that, you know, a wonderful project, obviously really important, and you did such a good job in laying out the rationale and your cultural sensitivity, and all of that is wonderful. So nicely done. So with that, I'll open the floor to panel members. Herb, did you have any questions? You're on mute, Herb. We cannot hear you, Herb. There, you there. Try
Good.
again. Yeah.
Okay, so lots of strength, clear structure, a good rationale, cultural sensitivity, engagement of multiple stakeholders. So all real positive. I was quite confused. You kept using the word intervention, and this is more or less relates back to what Baljenda said. An intervention typically at the very, there's different kinds. I mean, the RCT is you've got a control group. A weak intervention is you have a pretest, post-test. Post-test only is not really an intervention. And it gets confusing because this study is an intervention, but what you're evaluating doesn't have anything to do with the intervention. I mean, it has something to do with the intervention, but you're not evaluating the effectiveness of it. And that to me is a critical issue, particularly in a study that is an RCT and there was a control group. Now, I guess this study, what's happening is that you're getting a little piece of a larger study, because obviously there's something, there is more data. And so the question is whether or not you have access to that data and can incorporate it into what you're talking about. So what I understand what you're doing is that you're not going to evaluate the effects of the intervention, but maybe you can evaluate people's perspectives on the intervention in a way that might lead to its improvement and so forth. This is a pretty critical issue that needs to be resolved. Part of it is semantics, but also part of it is what constitutes a thesis. A second question I had, have you done any kind of literature search for how many articles are there about preschool Indigenous interventions?
Not many, and to be honest, last year has been spent focused on study 2, study 3, modifying the interview questions to cater for, you know, developmental differences in preschoolers. So a lot of the focus of last year has been on study 2 and study 3, and to be honest, not much on study 1.
So when you say not many, there's some?
Not many.
There's any?
I'll have to get back to you.
Okay.
I mean, you know, a general search, it didn't find specifically, from a preliminary search, I couldn't find anything on Indigenous preschoolers. But that's not to say that there aren't any out there. It's just from my initial general search, I couldn't find any on Indigenous preschoolers.
That would be my intuition as well. And I think that's going to require some further thought as to how you get around that problem. I mean, you can broaden the criteria out. So you look at interventions for preschoolers more generally. I mean, you gave us a whole litany of verbiage about homogeneity and stuff like that, but I'm not sure that that's particularly relevant if you've got almost no studies.
Yeah.
So I think what you're going to probably end up doing is more like a qualitative narrative. Are you focusing on quantitative or qualitative results in the study, or both, or whatever?
Both. The intention was, and again, this is all I can't speak, but so it was both, just to see what comes out first and then make a decision.
Because I would have expected that for the CoC, you would have at least done a preliminary search to get a sense of, you know, not a final selection, but have some ballpark estimate as to how many studies there were.
Sorry, Herb, I did sit with an ACU research librarian and we did conduct but I can't off the top of my head remember how many results we got. But there is research out there. It's just not as extensive as, say, looking at preschool literacy interventions in general.
Okay. In any case, that's something that you'll need to look at in terms of whether, if there's not enough studies to justify a systematic review, and particularly a meta-analysis, then maybe you need to either change the scope of what you're looking at, or change it to a narrative review rather than a systematic review. And I mean, I think a lot of the terminology that you used in terms of that was just boilerplate that doesn't have any particular relevance to what you're going to be able to do with what you've got. Who are the stakeholders?
So the stakeholder, not a problem. Caregivers, so caregivers, so parents, grandparents, the early childhood educators, the centre directors, 2ICs, the those administering the intervention, so the preschool champions, and we wanted to also interview elders, but unfortunately we couldn't. Yeah, but Dr. Jenny McMullen was able to interview like a community member as well.
Now, did you conduct these interviews?
So both Dr. Jennifer McMullen and I conducted the interviews. Okay,
so you had hands-on in terms of the doing the interviews.
Yeah.
Okay, well those are the main concerns, but some of them I think are kind of major. But the presentation was fine. It was a well presented document, but there are some design issues that need to be addressed.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate
it. Yeah. Jesse, did you have any comments?
Yeah. I agree. First, I agree. Belinda and Herb, a lot of positive things from the CoC. The purpose, restrictions, and the rationale are clear to me. I got some questions regarding the written document, because I saw in Catalan version it's only chapter 3. So your CoC only contains chapter 3, or you got chapter 1, 2 as well?
No, only chapter 3.
Yeah. I think from the guideline, I think the chapter 3 is too short. Because like in the CoC, a formal CoC document, you need to have a proper introduction or your thesis, and they have a brief summary of methodology, because like I think the methodology is missing in chapter 3. probably you need to also include some design and content of the intervention. So yeah, there's the written curriculum. Probably you need to enhance a little bit. I got a question regarding the study 2 and 3 about like the sampling. So how do you select the interview sample from study 3 or 2 and 2?
So it was whoever engaged in the literacy intervention within the previous 15 weeks so the larger scale study, an RCT study was done, and so it's purposive sampling for us. It's just whoever engaged in that literacy intervention at that time was then asked for an interview.
Okay.
Yeah.
All of them or some?
No, so we had 49, I believe it was not n equals 49, but I think from that we only were able to interview 25 children, partly because one of the centers it was school holidays and one of the centers was closed, and another reason was some of the preschoolers were ill that day, and they were also ill because we went back to do makeup days and they were also ill during that time as well. So we were on country from Monday to Friday. So we did try and get them again, but unfortunately they were still unwell.
So they all come from the experimental group, right?
Yes, correct, yes.
I think I'll finish my questions.
Thanks.
I had one other comment to make. I think that as part of the CoC, I would have expected a rather detailed discussion of the intervention.
Yep.
I mean, the whole purpose of it is to evaluate the intervention, but there was no context of what the intervention was.
Yeah. And that's fair enough, Herb. But in my defense, with 20 minutes and trying to get through the large scale.
No, I'm not talking necessarily about the this. I was talking about the paper itself.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Herb and Jessie. I'd like to open the floor for the wider audience. I see one hand up. John Marshall.
Thanks, Baljinder. I just had a comment. I liked your reaction to it. My impression was that your studies 2 and 3 would be much more valuable if done before the intervention rather than after the intervention. Like you do a pilot test, then you do your studies 2 and 3, improve the intervention, have a lot of purpose and meaning to these interventions, and then you do the intervention. So what about doing it before rather than after, just to get your reaction?
Yes, so I mean, and that's a good point. I guess the purpose of this PhD is to look at the impact it's had on preschoolers who have already engaged in the intervention. So for me, it would make sense to interview them after the intervention has taken place. We did run a pilot test. Both Dr. Jenny McMullen and I went out there and we did a pilot test on 10 students. And basically we wanted to ascertain whether the research questions, whether the research questions were going to meet the outcomes that they were intended to do, but also to see whether it would be beneficial for us to interview the preschoolers in pairs, whether that would likely lead them to engage in more open communication with us or independently. And what the pilot studies revealed is that the questions were okay, and it was better for us to interview them independently because one would tend to dominate the conversation, and two, they would get distracted with each other. So that was the pilot test that we ran, and then we moved into data collection. Sorry, does that answer your question or not really?
Not really, but I just wanted to get your reaction to it. That's all.
Yeah.
All right, we have time for maybe one more question before Taryn has a question. Go ahead, Taryn.
Yeah. Thanks, Rebecca. So I'm coming at this as a total novice to qualitative research. So it sounds like, am I right that you've already done the interviews with these groups and now, okay. So can you tell me about the extent to which preschool age children were sort of aware that this program existed at all. Like I have a preschool age son. I don't think he could tell me anything that goes on at preschool.
Yeah.
I'm sort of curious the extent to which they know that it occurs and the
Yeah.
extent to which their perspectives about the effectiveness are, I'm trying to put this nicely, but like relevant. Like they have nothing to compare it to. Like what's the insight that you're getting from them that you don't get from just talking to the educators who do have something to compare this to?
Yeah, and I agree with you, Taryn. I also have a 5 or 4-year-old when I was looking at the research questions, and that's why I really pushed to adapt them to suit the developmental level of a 4-year-old or 5-year-old, because I'm well aware that you can ask them questions and they have no idea what you're talking about. And that's why I used visual props from the intervention and showed them as a reminder, serving as a reminder for what they'd actually been exposed to. And you're right, because they had engaged in that intervention over 15 weeks, and what are the chances of them being able to recall things from the top of their head? But with visual cues, visual aids, and giving them multiple options in how they respond to the questions, really elicited some wonderful feedback from the children. Most of them knew how to identify letters and sounds. Most of them could explain, in their simple terms, what these Indigenous books that they were reading were about. So yes, I agree. You're not going to get as much detailed explanations from children as you would say an adult, but I still think it's important that we consider their perspective, and some were really able to shine and share what they'd learned, and others weren't so much. But I think it's still important that we consider their perspectives regardless.
Okay, yeah, cool, interesting.
Rebecca, could you just elaborate a bit more on like why it's important to get their perspectives? I think maybe that part still wasn't answered. So if you can explain why it's important to get the children's perspectives in addition to the stakeholders, I think that would be a good note to end on.
So in the past, children were seen as passive, you teach them all that they need to know, and they basically, do as they're told. What we know now is, no, they're actually actively engaged in their learning. They are contributors to their learning. And so why not listen to what they say and listen to their perspectives? I mean, for me, it's a no-brainer, because we need a holistic understanding of the impact of this program, and so for me that does include children.
Okay, great. I think we need to wrap up, and if I could request everyone except the CoC panel stay on the call.